this is our agenda today, and I think my colleagues would indicate that we'd be remiss if we didn't say that with prioritization, one really, really needs to discuss strategy because that's a significant aspect of prioritization. And then another fundamental concept of course, is that we're not implying that you can have some documents ready. In order to be compliant to the medical device regulation, all the documents need to be ready at the time and prepared and organized at the time of compliance. So these are just some concepts to consider when you're determining which set of documents or systems to consider first. So that's just a kind of a disclaimer related to prioritization. We will speak briefly about post-market surveillance, though we also appreciate that later in the day there are 2 sessions on post-market surveillance, and that just emphasizes the significance of post-market surveillance in the MDR. We also, of course, will emphasize 3 particular elements of the technical documentation, and that is the General Safety and Performance Requirements Checklist, the technical documentation file, as well as your clinical evaluation report. And then, time permitting, we have a few kind of additional concepts that we think are fun, but just things to think about and to consider as you go through your MDR transition. So we have an MDR readiness checklist, which is essentially a series of questions to walk the manufacturer through and to consider in their gap assessment, gap analysis. And particularly item 5 is seminal, which is just the question of, have you done a gap analysis and identified potential gaps between the medical device directives and your medical device regulation? And we all appreciate how important quality plan is as part of this transition. And we'll probably refer to that a few times. It really helps structure and organize and describe the different areas of compliance, the functional areas, and who's responsible for what. And we do see a lot of MDR teams that are developed because of the MDR and that are used to assess all these different requirements. And just to make a comment that the EU Commission has a good document that they released in 2018 that's titled Implementation Model for Medical Device Regulations. And it's kind of also a series of step-by-step questions to help guide a manufacturer through that process. As part of this readiness checklist, and you'll see an image on the right side of that EU Commission implementation model document. As part of that, though, we should remind everyone that, we appreciated that when the medical device regulation was drafted, many of the European medical device guidances, the MedDevs, were incorporated as legal text into the MDR. Well, one thing that a manufacturer should do is continue to monitor for guidance, because even with having many MedDevs incorporated into the MDR, the Medical Device Coordination Group, which was established by Article 103 of the MDR, they're also releasing guidance documents as well as other parts of the EU Commission. And one in particular for Class 1 medical devices is MDCG 2019-15 for Class 1. But we'll try to refer to some of the other ones as we go through the presentation. But there's a significant amount of guidance that's being released and that's planned for release. So if you go, and one of our references is the European Commission website for these MDCG guidance documents, if you go to that, you'll also see kind of what they have as an ongoing work progress. So it also provides a program of other guidance documents that are currently in review and in discussion. So as part of regulatory strategy, you'll of course want to consider classification, so Class 1 self-certified medical devices, as well as what we refer to as Class 1 self-certified MDD devices, which are up-classified by the regulation, and then products which have a notified body issued MDDC marking certificate. And then, of course, those other elements which we'll discuss further in the presentation. We like to kind of posit that there are 2 categories of devices, and during our April 2020 webinar, we presented this as well, which is the concept that there are what we call early MDR certification products, and then the legacy devices. So I understand that one of our poll questions is, do you know what the date of application is, or what's the best way to characterize the date of application? And so just so we're all aware. And
we do have that poll. If you want me to go ahead, we are able to get the mic working. I apologize for that.
Great.
Do you want me to go ahead and start the poll here, or let me know when?
Oh, sure. Yes, please start the poll. So essentially, this queries everyone to determine kind of how well they've been monitoring the regulatory affairs in the EU, as well as what's happening with the medical device regulation. So hopefully we all responded to the last answer, which is just that the most accurate characterization of the date of application is, as we all know, the regulation was drafted with the date of application as passed already, so 26 May 2020, but there was regulation 2020-561, which extended the date of application 1 year. So as you'll see on the slide, the date of application is now the 26th of May 2021. And so this is a significant milestone in our transition. And I think everyone was fairly grateful for this reprieve. So going back to these two categories of products, for your early MDR certification, your Class 1 self-certified medical devices that are still Class 1 self-certified by the MDR, those products need to be compliant with the MDR on the date of application. So they can voluntarily be compliant now, or on the date of application, in order to continue to market, they would need to be compliant to the MDR. New devices, of course, would be within this category of early. And then Annex 16, which are products without an intended medical purpose, would also be part of this early. What would be considered legacy devices, and this term was previously used in MDCG Guidance 2019, but then really what we feel defined a little bit more formally in the MDCG 2020-6 document. So that defined legacy devices as devices with CE marking according to the MDD or AIMDD. So these legacy devices, and they're legacy at the point of date of application. So that's kind of the concept. But legacy devices would be your products with MDD issued notified body CE marking certificates, or these category of the core addendum 2 products, which are Class 1 self-certified by the MDD and then classified by the MDR. And then, of course, the example that most of us probably are familiar with are the software products, which possibly were classified as Class 1 self-certified according to Rule 12 under the MDD, but now because of Rule 11 in the MDR, potentially would be up-classified. And then one last comment about this slide is that there are transitional provisions in Article 120 for these legacy products, and that essentially they can continue to be marketed after the date of application and until 26 May of 2024. So they have this, and then that's provided for the MDD for the notified body issued MDD CE marking products. That's of course provided that the certificates have not expired. So these are the timeline considerations that are very significant in the whole concept of prioritization and strategy. And so to further expand upon regulatory strategy, clearly Article 123 says that if there's a significant change in design and intended purpose for your legacy device, that you can no longer rely on this concept of legacy device, and you would need to be compliant to the MDR. And this, of course, applies to those Class 1 self-certified MDD devices that are up-classified. So very important to understand that significant change in design and intended purpose would lead to would necessitate compliance to the MDR. And there is, on significant change, there is the MDCG 2020-3 guidance, which was released in March on significant change. And really, up until that point, there was only some discussion of significant change in the competent authority medical device frequently asked questions from January 2018. So really, this MDCG 2020-3 document is helpful in describing scenarios which would constitute a significant change. And you'll realize that there are flow charts very analogous to the US FDA guidance documents on assessing when you would file a new 510K for a change. So that's in MDCG 2020-3. And then we just remind everyone that if there's also a significant change in state-of-the-art to legacy devices, this would very possibly lead to also a need to demonstrate compliance with MDR. So you would likely not be able to continue to leverage your CE marking to the MDD. A comment that we all likely appreciate is that notified body capacity is an important consideration. And I think if we just looked at that at the European NANDO database, and at this time, there are 14 notified bodies designated to the MDR. And the EU Commission published a report in March of this past year. And in the report, they indicated that there were 44 applications for designation to the MDR, and that represents 42 of the 49 current notified bodies. So 86% of the notified bodies have applied to be designated or have been designated. So activity of notified bodies is really a significant aspect. And then we just mentioned, just in the interest of completeness, all these notified bodies that have ceased activity, and we're all aware of those notified bodies. And then, of course, if the notified body is based in the UK, though we all are aware that BSI and SGS have designated entities in other EU locations now and have, for the most part, transferred many of their manufacturers to those entities in the Netherlands or in Belgium, respectively. We mentioned Switzerland, or what's we've heard referred to as Swexit, as a possibility to monitor that Switzerland may no longer recognize the medical device regulation, but the delay of the date of application was a relief for Swexit as well, but something also to continue monitoring. And then one concept that we want to share is that based on the number of notified bodies, based on the certificates that are to the MDD and that would need to be transitioned to the MDR, we expect that the largest number of certificates will likely be issued between August 2023 and May 2024. And of course, May 2024 is for the most part that deadline. And we're also kind of positing that the best period for your MDR, your notified body issued MDR certificate will be between 2021 and 2022 because of this anticipated increase in notified body activity reviewing to the MDR. So again, the idea is we all need to be proactive about compliance to the MDR, even though compliance at this time is voluntary until the date of application. We certainly recommend that manufacturers start to more aggressively and proactively think about transitioning for compliance to the MDR. And then this slide just depicts the one kind of concept of sell-off provision, which is described in Article 122. And sell-off was actually a term that was advanced by the Competent Authority Medical Device Committee in their frequently asked questions document, that the notified body issued MDD certificates would have to, the latest they could be issued to, or they would need to expire on 26 May 2024, but manufacturers, provided those products are on the market, manufacturers would have a year in which to sell off, and that's exactly the term that's used. They would have a year to sell off those products, and then on 26 May 2025, there could be no kind of selling of those products, even though they were on the EU market. There could be no selling of those products after 26 May 2020. So clinical strategy, of course, also very, very significant and related to regulatory strategy and some of the fundamental concepts. Is there sufficient clinical evidence on the device. And we would say that this isn't defined in the MDR. And even though that guidance document MDCG 2020-6 discusses sufficient clinical evidence, it also does not describe and define that. So the onus is on the manufacturer, of course, to establish what's sufficient. And there is guidance in that MDCG document. And particularly for legacy or new devices, this is going to be, this clinical strategy is going to need to be assessed. And there is the guidance, the MDCG 2020-6 is for legacy devices. So really for new devices, and particularly new devices which are implantable in class 3, as we realize from Article 61.4, that those products are going to need clinical investigations unless they can meet one of the exemptions. But for the most part, the new implantable in class 3 devices, one would expect clinical investigations on those devices. And, very seminal in this entire clinical strategy assessment is equivalence. So the question really is, and equivalence is now formally defined in the medical device regulation in Annex 14, Part A, and it's defined as the definition that's been advanced in the European guidance in the MedDev. And so, of course, though, with equivalence for implantable in class 3, Article 61.5 says that you really need a contract with the manufacturer of that equivalent medical device. And so that's really unlikely if this equivalent device is manufactured by a competitor. And then analogous to MedDev 271 revision 4, in Annex 14, Part A, Section 3, there is there's a description that the manufacturer needs sufficient levels of access to the technical documentation on the equivalent device. So very, very aligned with MedDev 271 revision 4. So really what we feel with equivalence is it's unlikely that manufacturers would be able to leverage this equivalence strategy, and they should really assess whether they need to use equivalence and whether it's beneficial to them. So I think it goes without saying that this kind of strategy assessment would also need to consider the actual MDR gap analysis as well as the business portfolio. So a few comments about post-market surveillance, since it's such a significant aspect of the MDR and of compliance. And one comment is that we all realize that there is an explicit requirement for legacy devices on the date of application. So there's no question that even if a manufacturer has a notified body issued MDD certificate, or they have an upclassified product by the MDR, that they are required to be compliant to the MDR post-market surveillance provisions. So because on the date of application. So because of this is certainly one area that we feel should be prioritized. And one comment to make about Article 123 is that it's clearly identified in the regulation that manufacturers with legacy devices need to be compliant to the provisions on post-market surveillance and vigilance, but it's not clear whether provisions such as described within Article 10 to 15 of the regulation apply. And that's, does liability for the manufacturer, does the manufacturer need a person responsible for regulatory compliance, and so forth. And we understand because, and this, if you query different notified bodies and different notified body individuals, you may get divergent responses. And so we understand that this is now a topic that will be discussed within the NB Med Group. So hopefully there will be, or we would expect that there would be a consensus position on the interpretation of, for legacy devices on the date of application, do the person responsible for regulatory compliance, is that required for the legacy, for the manufacturer with the legacy devices, and so forth. So continue to monitor that and for that type of document, because that's an important, significant aspect of MDR compliant. Of course, post-market surveillance is linked to risk management and understanding of residual risks, and also to the risk management process as well, benefit risk determination. We all know that all manufacturers must perform post-market surveillance, and as we elaborated before, all manufacturers, irrespective of whether they are compliant to the MDR on the date of application or they are legacy devices, they must perform post-market surveillance compliant to the MDR. And then, because of all this, what we would recommend is that the manufacturers start to develop as a priority their procedures on post-market surveillance and vigilance, as well as the necessary post-market surveillance template. So the post-market surveillance plan, the post-market surveillance report, and the periodic summary update report. And we have the definition of post-market surveillance on the right, this is the first time it was formally defined is within the medical device regulation. So just some more definitions on post-market surveillance, and we know that there will be subsequent presentations on post-market surveillance, so we will not spend much time on these slides, but just to really, and this particular slide hopefully is helpful background information on the comparison between the Medical Device Directive and MedDev 212.1 Revision 8, as well as the provisions in the MDR on vigilance reporting. So for the most part, the MDR aligns with MedDev 212.1 Revision 8. There is a reduced timeline for reporting all other serious incidents. There's an emphasis on trend reporting. There's a few new definitions, and of course, for the first time within legislation, field safety corrective action was defined as well, even though that was advanced in MedDev 212.1. I believe Revision 5 was the first time that concept was introduced. But so now these are formal definitions within the regulation. Of course, reporting by UDAMED once this becomes functional, and we all know that there's currently a two-year delay of UDAMED. And then there are new forms which are introduced, and they are mandatory for both MDD and MDR devices. So those are some of the considerations for revising your vigilance QSP. And then this last slide, and this is actually extracted from our procedure on post-market surveillance, really because it emphasizes the importance of post-market surveillance with all the other regulatory documents and regulatory systems and processes. So we have here the post-market surveillance plan, which is described in Annex 3 of the MDR, and data from your post-market surveillance is included, of course, within all your other regulatory documents. So it would be considered in your clinical evaluation report, in risk management, and then would also, lead to your periodic safety update report as well as your PMS report. So really, this is intended to depict all the important aspects related to post-market surveillance and how really fundamental a system it is within the context of your quality management system and within the context of your regulatory documents. And then to describe the technical documents that would form a basis for prioritizing and for considering review now, we're going to highlight the General Safety Performance Requirements Checklist, as well as the technical documentation file and the CER. I think this is the first time within the legislation that there is a good discussion of how to complete the General Safety Performance Requirements Checklist, which is, of course, analogous to your Annex 1 essential requirements of the directives. There's a really good discussion of how to complete the GSPR checklist, and we've just included an example of how one would go through the exercise of doing that. So really a very useful exercise at this point, if a manufacturer hasn't done that already, is to compare the essential requirements checklist with the general safety performance requirement checklist and determine whether there are any additional requirements that are necessitated by the MDR, and then to start the exercise of completing the general safety performance requirement checklist. So that's certainly one area of prioritization. And it's also a good opportunity to review standards and understand which standards a manufacturer is compliant to. As we're aware, there is no currently published official Journal of European Union list of standards to the MDR, so that review is currently in progress. And recently there was a republication in the official Journal of European Union of the standards that demonstrate the European norm harmonized standards, which demonstrate compliance to the MDD. And this was recently published, but really there was no change between the previous OJEU list, other than to add a few additional standards that related to products that would be necessary because of this pandemic. So a standard for surgical masks was included. So really not much of a change between the previously published list for the MDD and this recently published list. But standards are certainly important, and as we heard from Edwin Bills earlier, EN ISO 14971 2019, of course, is the standard that a manufacturer should be compliant to, even though standards are voluntary in the EU, for risk management. So this is just a little bit more introduction. And again, this is now all, for the most part, described within Annex 2 of the MDR on general safety performance requirement. So on the technical documentation file, a manufacturer should review their existing MDD technical file or design dossier. And while Annex 2 provides a structure and a format, we would recommend using that as the organization for a manufacturer's technical documentation file. And that would be in conjunction with notified body guidance, because many of these notified bodies have now shared guidance on MDR compliance and the technical documentation file. And really, a manufacturer needs to ensure that there is sufficient information. I think one thing we want to make it very, very clear, and we heard this from a recent BSI communication, we want to make it very, very clear, is that even lower risk devices will be assessed as vigorously as the higher risk devices. And we've performed a fair number of MDD tech file design dossier reviews already, and these are manufacturers who indicate or feel that their documentation is compliant to the MDR. We've performed a fair number of reviews, and our general observation is that manufacturers have not included sufficient information in these in their draft MDR technical documentation files. That the level of detail, the amount of explanation, the narrative, that all needs to be enhanced. And we've even seen notified body MDD reviews recently that reflect that more vigorous review from a notified body. So really, there needs to be sufficient information for the reviewer to understand the aspects required that are described within Annex 2. And so, again, this is good documentation practice, but really within your technical documentation file, there should be narrative text to provide a description and understanding to the user. And we always advance the use of tables that they very effectively and quickly can communicate data and test report data, for example, to demonstrate compliance for biocompatibility. So your series of EN ISO 10993 standards, that you would be able to use a table and document within that table your compliance, your compliance for your biocompatibility compliance. And then another really fundamental aspect, and that's significant in the regulation, is just your consistency in content between the different regulatory documents. And this is something we've observed, with the directives, but even more so with the regulation, with the substantial number of documents that that are now required is that there are many sections where text should be just reused between regulatory documents, even though different groups and departments within the manufacturer, within the company, are responsible, that there should be consistency within those, and some idea of just using the text and the sections from that other regulatory document to minimize issues. So that's really one of the concepts that we want to remind everyone of. This is just a screenshot of kind of some of the organization of an MDR technical documentation file. And then here we'd like to kind of emphasize the importance of a clinical evaluation report. And the manufacturer should review their MDD CER and MedDev 271 revision 4. And interestingly enough, we still see MDD CERs which are not compliant to the current revision of the guidance. And that's really, really one area where a manufacturer needs to review and ensure that their current existing MDD CER is compliant to the MedDev. And then, of course, we've mentioned the MDCG guidance document. So in particular, MDCG 2020-5 on equivalence, and then 2020-6 on clinical evidence for legacy devices or devices which were compliant to the MDD and AIMDD. So that's really, really important. That should be reviewed in conjunction with Article 61 and Annex 14. And of course, Annex 14, if you're a fan of MedDev 271 revision 4, you'll appreciate that much of the structure of the guidance is included within Annex 14. As Edwin Bill said yesterday, there is no definition of state of the art in the regulation or really formally published, that you could arrive at a definition from reviewing the MDR. But EN ISO 14971 2019 does include a definition of state of the art now. So that is a useful reference if you want to have a working definition within your procedures. Really, the clinical evaluation plan should be aligned with the clinical evaluation reports. One conceivably could envision that many sections of your clinical evaluation report are identical and replicated within the CER, and that there shouldn't be differences between those two documents. And again, we're going to emphasize the consistency and content between the different regulatory documents. So labeling, risk management, clinical data, clinical investigational data, published literature, PMS data, and publicly available vigilance data. And that's probably something that it's this comment about consistency is mentioned in the MDCG guidance documents, but it's also something that we've observed fairly routinely when we review manufacturers' clinical evaluation reports. That's one area that really could pretty readily be improved, is just ensuring the consistency in your different regulatory documents, potentially by using the same text and information and not trying to rewrite it, paraphrase it again in different regulatory documents. That potentially would minimize some of the issues and areas, and and help improve consistency between all these different documents. And then again, two other additional concepts that are going to be important is similar devices, which was defined in the MDCG document. So similar devices, this is required within the Annex 2 MDR technical documentation file, as well as within the clinical evaluation report. So that the importance of similar devices, equivalent devices, if you use that regulatory strategy, but we really feel in the context of the MDR that's not, unless it's a device that's within your own device portfolio, that concept of equivalent device is really not one that can be used because of the increased burdens described in Article 61, Section 5, as well as in Annex 14, Part A. And then that state of the art is really a fundamental concept, both in risk management, in the clinical evaluation report, in the MDR. So. And then just a few additional recommendations, which we'll quickly go through, is just the importance of symbols, which we recognize from the medical device directive, but continues with the regulation, the importance of monitoring and being aware of standards as well as guidance. So, use of harmonized standards, this hasn't changed. It's still advanced within the regulation as it was in the MDD. There is a revision of EN ISO 15223 to add new symbols to comply with the MDR. Just maybe a side comment that the symbol MD for medical devices, that's a requirement in the MDR to designate that a product is a medical device. But also, if you look at the MDCG guidance document on implants, you'll notice that they suggest that that MD symbol is used to then subsequently provide the moniker of the product. So that's something to think about when you look at implants, is that MDCG guidance document for your summary of safety for your implant card. And then there is a revision to EN 1041 2008, and so we've just highlighted that there, as well as we'll go through so just the importance of symbols, standards, and guidance. And then kind of our last kind of conclusion is that really no certification is that certain unless you have your MDR certification, and particularly for higher risk medical devices, your notified body issued MDR certificate. We recommend, of course, as well as everyone else would, that a manufacturer start implementing as much of the MDR as possible. It really just provides practice and is required in case you're within that early category of transition. So if you're forced to have to transition, there's a lot of other important elements that are required for compliance, which we really didn't discuss, such as UDAMED and UDI, and these are all that need to be implemented. And there are different timelines to them as described in the MDR. And ultimately, prioritization still means all the MDR compliant documents prepared at the time of MDR compliance, but there are aspects and elements that can be considered first to start thinking about and developing as part of your transition strategy. And we certainly appreciate your time. I think we apologize for those technical difficulties and the fact that there's no video here. I think just one passing comment is this entire pandemic has been unfortunate, but it really makes me feel, and I know my colleagues feel, that regulatory and quality professionals are heroes. If you monitoring what's going on, you'll also know that a lot of regulators are now publishing safeguards because of products that are placed on the market which are not compliant or which have kind of insufficient regulatory information. And it's regulatory and compliance professionals and quality professionals that help ensure that products are safe and perform as intended. So really, thank you all, because we're all heroes as part of this medical device regulatory enterprise. And then the last slide just highlights a few references that may be of interest. Really, just again, the importance of monitoring the EU Commission websites. They're constantly providing guidance and publishing MDCG guidance documents, and these are really helpful in understanding aspects of the MDR. So great. I again, thank you for your time, and certainly if there are any questions that we might be able to entertain.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Evangeline. And again, reiterated, apologize on the technical difficulties there. My mic cut out and wouldn't let me call back in, but we were able to get it figured out. And before we do dive into the questions, we're going to go about 8 minutes over here. We'll go to about the next year. During her 13-year career at Emergo, a leading regulatory consulting firm specializing in global medical device and IVD compliance, Evangeline has assisted hundreds of medical device manufacturers with global regulatory strategy, registration, and consulting projects. Her area of expertise include CE marking, clinical evaluation reports, and now performance evaluation reports, global vigilance, and device classifications in markets worldwide. She has been intimately involved in the transition from the directives to the regulations and the related regulatory requirements. Evangeline is a key architect in developing tools for Emergo's Regulatory Affairs Management Suite, RAMS software, which you should all go check out if you haven't. Google Emergo RAMS, and you'll be able to find that. All righty, thank you very much, Evangeline, and let's dive into a couple questions here. Just to kick off, we got the first one here. Can CERs be combined with PMSRs? So much of these are overlapping.
That's a great question. I would say that they are combined insofar as it is correct that there does appear to be, I wouldn't say redundant information, but the same data sets are required in some of the PMS documents as well as the clinical evaluation report. So I wouldn't use combine the regulatory documents per se, but I would use the concept of these data sets are used within several different regulatory documents, and they need to be considered and assessed within those regulatory documents. And that then kind of goes back to my comment about ensuring the consistency of the data within your different regulatory documents. So if you can map that out and develop a good program, then you won't feel that it's so quote unquote redundant, so to speak.
Thank you for that. And then Stuart asked, is the MDR TD file builder tool that is available, is that from EU or is that an Emergo document?
So that is a document that what we profiled in the slides, that RAMS Smart Builder is an Emergo by UL platform. So that is a platform that we offer, but the concept that's fundamental is ensure that your information is consistent among all your different EU regulatory documents. So develop and design your system so that the data that you're using is used across your different documents. And I think what happens, and we all appreciate this, is that there are different departments and divisions and groups that are responsible for different regulatory documents. And because of that, that's where you start to see the introduction of divergence, because different groups will take that same base area and rewrite it and rephrase it and massage it. And then that leads to inconsistency. So using the same device description across your different documents will certainly help eliminate issues with inconsistency.
All right, thank you very much. And then we got another question here. How often should the GSPR checklist be reviewed? Does the checklist need to be updated periodically?
So absolutely. The GSPR checklist, as with any of the European regulatory documents, are what we call living documents and do need to be reviewed periodically. This should align with the timing that you describe in your procedures for review of standards as well as the legislation. So certainly, yes, the GPSR is a living document. I think this is, of course, we all appreciate in contrast to a filing with the US FDA for a 510K, that once you cleared that 510K, only if you make a change and assess that as a change which needs to be submitted again to the FDA, would you then touch that 510K. This is in contrast to the EU, where for their GSPR checklist, as well as your TDF file, you need to constantly review those documents to ensure that they are up to date and compliant. And then this, of course, very fundamentally includes standards as part of that.
Awesome. Thank you for clarifying. We got a question that this has been a hot topic for the last year or so. Nowadays, it's really difficult to find a notified body who takes new customer certification. Do you have any thoughts or ideas of when you think notified bodies will accept new medical device applications?
So that's a great question. I would say that we are still aware of a few notified bodies accepting MDD CE marking reviews for new products. So we kind of mentioned that those notified bodies, though, are reviewing more vigorously and starting to align their reviews with that align their review so they would be more analogous to an MDR review. But we're still aware of a few notified bodies that are accepting new devices. We haven't heard from some of the large notified bodies whether, because of this delay in the date of application, whether they would accept new medical devices to be certified to the MDD. So we haven't heard about any notified body publicly announcing that they would, and partially because there's theoretically only less than a year now to the MDR date of application. So I haven't heard about that, but we do know that there's still notified bodies reviewing to the MDD for some of the lower risk classifications of devices.
All righty, sounds like some research to do, but you can find them. We'll just do one or two more questions here. Judy asked, if you have MDD products already sold and placed on the market beyond May 26, 2025, e.g. in a warehouse, can you continue to distribute them?
So the kind of the high level response is it really depends on what type of warehouse are you referring to and what do you mean by sold. I think if on May 26, 2025, you had already sold that device to a hospital and it just happens to be in your warehouse, I think for what we've reviewed, related to Brexit, that would be absolutely acceptable then to subsequently provide that to the hospital. But if you're referring to selling on 26 May 2025, even though it's in your EU warehouse, no, that's the sell-off provision has ended, and that's what's explicitly stated in Article 123 about sell-off. So there's slight kind of variances to that response depending on the actual scenario.
All righty, and just one final question here. Are there any significant differences between clinical evidence expectations from MDR to other global regulations such as FDA?
So are there any significant
differences between clinical evidence expectations from the MDR to other global regulatory bodies such as FDA?
So in general, we would say that certainly with the MDR, the clinical evidence requirements are increasing for the EU. So even more aligned with the US FDA. We would say, though, that compared to the FDA, the clinical evaluation report includes clinical investigation. So if we're referring to a class 2 510K clear device, you might not necessarily compile that clinical evaluation report as you would in the EU. You would certainly presumably have clinical investigational data for both to support the device in both countries, but so I don't know if there's a good answer to that question, or if I could articulate a good answer to that question. I will say that what we've observed is a lot of manufacturers perform in the EU post-market clinical follow-up studies, and that's also part of a US FDA IDE. So they're using that data to support potentially their 510K clearance or their PMA approval in the US. And that becomes one of your regulatory strategies about whether to continue to see market that product is this data being used in other markets, and particularly in the US, to support a regulatory filing with the US FDA.
All righty, and we are right at the end of time here. And Evangeline Loh, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Emergo Group by UL, thank you so much for the presentation. And Evangeline, where can people learn more about Emergo's services and the RAMS platform?
Well, we certainly have that available on our website. You can certainly search for that. I didn't include that as a specific reference. I believe possibly on one of the included slides in the handout. We can certainly, and I've included my contact information, so I can certainly be contacted about that as well, if that's of interest.
All righty. Thank you so much. And like I mentioned earlier, we're very excited about a recent alliance that we had with Emergo by UL, the two companies, Greenlight and Emergo. So if you have any questions about that alliance and the offerings we put together, please reach out. And thank you very much. And we'll see you at the next session. Thank you, Evangeline.
Great. Thank you.